New inventions and technologies helped fuel the great economic expansion of the late 19th century. In the decades after the Civil War, steam and electricity replaced human and animal strength. Iron replaced wood, and steel replaced iron. The Bessemer process made the production of steel more economical. Before the Bessemer process, it took an entire day to produce 5 tons of steel. Afterwards, the same quantity of steel could be made in a mere 15 minutes. In short, 48 days' worth of steel could now be made in one day. This is the Bessemer process. The application of electricity was another one of the period's most significant developments. For its first commercial use, electricity was used as a means of communication along telegraph wires. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell, 1847 to 1892, an educator of the deaf, invented the telephone. The telephone and the telegraph allowed people to communicate across great distances. In 1879, Thomas Edison combined the right kind of inert gas and glowing metal filament to produce the first effective electric light bulb. These are the inventors and their inventions from the time period. Electricity also ran motors, which started to be used to drive the machinery in the factories. By 1900, electricity was also being used to power an increasing number of other types of machines, including electric streetcars and subway trains. Electrical refrigerators were introduced in the 1920s. Each new technological innovation had a dramatic effect on raising people's standard of living as well as on the nation's economy. In this slide, you see some inventions of the late 19th and early 20th century: streetcars, machine factories, and the refrigerator. At first, the government did little to regulate big business. Government leaders believed in a laissez-faire type of economy, the theory that the government should not interfere in the operation of the free market. Of course, even under a laissez-faire system, the government had a role in the economy. It provided laws to protect property and enforce contracts. It establishes a system of patents to promote inventions and enact tariffs to help manufacturers. Many believed that the economy worked best when it was not burdened by the government's regulations. Government leaders also doubted that the Constitution gave them the right to regulate business. However, some of the anti-competitive practices of business were so glaring that reformers called for legislation to remedy them and giving the government an even greater role. Before the Civil War, most American businesses were owned by individuals or by groups of partners. After the Civil War, the corporate form of business was much more common. A corporation is a company chartered by a state and recognized in law as a separate person. A corporation issues shares to investors, also known as stocks, making each shareholder a partial owner. The more stock a person owns, the larger is that person's share of the corporation. Owners of stock share in the corporation's profits in the form of dividends. They can also sell their stocks to other buyers. The shareholder is only responsible for the shares he or she owns in the company. The investor cannot otherwise be sued or held responsible for company losses. The corporate form of enterprise made it possible for many people to pool their money together. This made it possible for companies to raise vast sums of money required to build railroad lines, coal and iron mines, steel mills, and large mass production factories. Corporations made modern industrial production possible. In this slide, you see the graph of supply and demand, and then 2 stocks for Standard Oil Company, owned by John D. Rockefeller, and the United States Steel Corporation, owned by Andrew Carnegie, who we'll speak of later. In the late 19th century, a truly national market emerged for the first time. Railroads, canals, telegraphs, and telephones linked together different parts of the country. Shipping raw materials and finished goods became less expensive. National producers could make and ship goods more cheaply than local producers. Since they could take advantage of more machinery and greater economies of scale, the high investment cost of mass production manufacturing required a large market to be profitable. New methods of selling were developed, such as department stores, chain stores, and mail-order houses, including Sears and Roebuck. Manufacturing could advertise in magazines and newspapers and sell the same goods throughout the country. After the war, separate crews of engineers and laborers worked from California eastward and from the middle of the country westward to lay the track they had cut through the high mountains of the Sierra Nevada. Many of the laborers working on the Transcontinental Railroad on the California side were Chinese immigrants. These immigrants received just $26 to $35 a month for 12-hour days, 6 days a week. They even had to provide their own food and tents. The two halves of the first Transcontinental Railroad were finally connected in 1869 at Promontory Point, Utah. The journey from coast to coast was instantly reduced from several months to a few weeks, bringing Americans closer together than ever before. This is the first Sears and Roebuck catalog. In this slide, you see the meeting of the East and West Transcontinental Railroad and then Chinese immigrant workers working on the Transcontinental Railroad. Andrew Carnegie worked his way up from a penniless Scottish immigrant to one of America's richest and most powerful men. He first worked as a boy in a cotton mill. Later, he was a telegraph operator for a railroad. Carnegie became best friends with the president of the railroad, who promoted him and advised him on investments. After the Civil War, Carnegie invested in ironworks and built a steel mill in Pittsburgh, selling iron and steel to railroad companies for tracks. With this profit, he bought other steel mills and founded the Carnegie Steel Corporation in 1892. His steel mills undercut the competition. He bought iron ore fields, coal mines, and ships so he could mine his own iron ore and ship it to his steel mills in Pennsylvania. Carnegie paid his workers low wage and forced them to work 12-hour-long shifts, while he crushed attempts by his workers to form labor unions. Carnegie spent his later life in acts of philanthropy, giving away $350 million to build libraries and endow universities. This is Andrew Carnegie and his book, The Gospel of Wealth. John D. Rockefeller made his fortune in the oil industry. In school, he had studied bookkeeping. Later, he started a successful company selling produce, fresh fruits and vegetables, and used his profits to build an early oil refinery in Cleveland, Ohio. Refining turns the crude oil taken from the ground into useful products. Oil in these days was mainly used to make kerosene to burn in lamps in place of whale oil. Rockefeller formed the Standard Oil Company in 1870. By 1879, his company controlled 90% of oil refining in the United States. By 1882, his company became a trust, which he controlled the largest portions of shares. Rockefeller's company continued to grow, becoming a virtual monopoly. A monopoly is a company having complete control over the supply of a product or service. He forced railroad companies to give him special secret rates for shipping his oil, while they charged his competitors higher prices. In 1892, the government forced Rockefeller to dissolve Standard Oil, which was divided in 20 smaller companies. Despite the breakup, the leaders of Standard Oil remained the main shareholders of the new companies. Like Carnegie, Rockefeller gave millions of his fortune away to education and science. For example, he helped found the University of Chicago and the Rockefeller Foundation. This is John D. Rockefeller and the results of his philanthropical donations. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. Railroads sometimes charged local farmers more to haul their crops over short distances than they charged for large companies to ship goods longer distances on more competitive national routes. Some states passed laws prohibiting this practice, but the U.S. Supreme Court held these laws to be unconstitutional. The court ruled that only Congress had the power to regulate interstate commerce. In response, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act. This federal law prohibited unfair practices by railroads, such as charging higher rates for shorter routes. A special regulatory commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission, was established to enforce this act. This was a landmark measure since it was the first time that Congress stepped in to regulate business in America. The Sherman Antitrust Act, 1890. The purpose of this federal law was to stop monopolies engaging in unfair practices that prevented fair competition. The act marked a significant change in the attitude of Congress towards the abuse of big business. The average workday and work week were long by today's standards, 10 to 14-hour days for 6 days a week. Employers hired the least expensive laborers, paying them an average of $3 to $12 weekly, but immigrants were often willing to work for far less. Women and children were also frequently employed as low-paid workers. As factories and workplaces grew larger, workers lost all personal contact with their employers. Jobs were offered on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. As industrialists sought to achieve greater speed and efficiency, each worker became nothing more than a human cog or wheel in a vast machine. Work became less skilled, more repetitive, monotonous, and boring. Industrial working conditions in the late 19th century were also often extremely hazardous. Safeguards around machinery were inadequate. Thousands of workers were injured or killed in industrial accidents each year. Textile mills and coal mines made use of child labor to perform special tasks. Machinery was rarely fenced off, and children were often exposed to moving parts of machines while they worked. Children might be used to move, clean, or fix large machines since they were small enough to fit between parts. Injuries to children were high in many factories. About 1/5 of all American children under the age of 15 worked outside the home in 1910. These children missed sunshine, fresh air, play, and the chance to improve their lives by attending school. Workers could be fired at any time for any reason. Bad economic times, manufacturers simply halted production and fired their employees. Workers lacked the benefits enjoyed by workers today, such as unemployment insurance, workers' compensation for injury on the job, and paid sick days. This is child labor in a textile mill. The Knights of Labor formed in 1869 and hoped to create a single national union by joining together all skilled and unskilled workers. The Knights demanded an 8-hour workday, high wages, and safety codes in factories. They also opposed child labor and supported equal pay for women. They also supported restrictions on immigration since they saw immigrants as competitors for jobs. Under the leadership of Terence Powderly, the Knights grew rapidly in the 1880s. But the Knights proved to be too loosely organized. Skilled workers resented being in the same union as unskilled laborers. After losing a series of major strikes, the Knights of Labor fell apart. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was founded in 1881 by Samuel Gompers. Gompers hoped to create a powerful union by uniting workers with similar economic interests. Unlike the Knights of Labor, the AFL consisted of separate unions of skilled workers which had joined together into a federation. The participating craft unions limited membership to skilled workers such as carpenters and cigar makers. Gompers limited his goals to winning economic improvements for their workers, higher pay, and an 8-hour workday and better working conditions. Gompers fought hard to improve members' job security by seeking closed shops, places where only union members could be hired. The AFL quickly emerged as a principal voice in organized labor. However, the AFL was weakened by its continuing exclusion of unskilled workers, who made up the bulk of the labor force. As late as 1910, less than 5% of American workers were unionized. Public opinion also supported the laissez-faire policies mentioned earlier in the PowerPoint. Many Americans believed that businesses should have the right to hire and fire employees as they pleased. Many were hostile to the unions because they feared workers' wages demands would lead to higher prices. Union activities were often also associated with violence and radical ideas. In the Haymarket Affair of 1886, labor leaders were blamed when a bomb exploded during a demonstration of striking workers at Haymarket Square in Chicago. 7 policemen were killed and 67 others were severely wounded.